Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well today. We've just had we have around 114 people registered, so we'll just wait a few minutes to let everybody join. Sometimes I think we should have holding music while we wait for people to join. I went to a meeting once and it had that. And I thought, oh, this is smart. Next time, we'll just give it one more minute. Okay, just get started then. And I can just do a short introduction, and then we'll move on to speakers. So if anybody else joins, they'll be able to come during that bit. So welcome everyone today to our third and final webinar in our three-part series looking at occupational segregation. My name is Kelsey Smith. I'm the head of Equally Safe at Work, and so I'll be introducing our speakers today, and then also facilitating the Q&A at the end. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you if you've joined the previous two as well. So just a bit of background. So tackling occupational segregation is key to our work at Close the Gap, as it is a driver of the gender pay gap, and we know that it's not well understood by policymakers, employers, and others working on women's employment. So that's why we wanted to look deeper at this issue, and this is why we've organized webinars to provide more information on what it is, what are the causes of occupational segregation, and then ultimately what can be done to address it. So our first session, we heard from our executive director at Close the Gap, as well as Equate Scotland and Gender Friendly Scotland on the different causes of occupational segregation. And so there's a link to the YouTube video for that recording if you missed it, that we can share afterwards as well. And then last session, which was about 2 weeks ago, we heard from ScotRail and First Bus on the different ways that they've tried to increase the number of women in their male-dominated workforces. And that was through different sort of targeted recruitment campaigns, trying to increase their offers of flexible working, also consulting with staff on their experiences in the workplace and trying to make changes to better support them in the organization. As well, we've got a YouTube link for that we'll share. And so for this session today, we'll be looking further at undervaluation, which is key to occupational segregation. And so undervaluation comes from economics, and what that means is that for women's work, there's evidence of lower returns for women's productive characteristics. So what this means is that work, which is typically done by women, tends to be poorly valued and underpaid, and it means that women will receive lower pay from investing in education or from their own work experience. And so this concept of undervaluation underpins gender inequality and the gender pay gap. So women's work is obviously undervalued in the labour market, and then at an organisational level, women's skills and contributions are often less valued than their male counterparts. And this undervaluing of women's work contributes to women's higher levels of poverty. We know that 2/3 of workers earning below the real living wage are women, and women's poverty is linked to children's poverty. And so the undervaluing of occupations is linked to stereotyping and expectations placed on women, which is something we covered in the first webinar. And historically, women have carried out similar roles in the home, such as caring and cleaning. And because of this, women's work has received lower status and value because the skills required to do these jobs are perceived as being sort of inherently women in women. And so as a result, they're not fairly remunerated. So we're very pleased to be joined today by our two speakers. So we have Lauren Nelson-Mackey from the Women's Campaign Unit at GMB, and also Eileen McKenna from the Royal College of Nursing. And so we know that unions have driven forward a lot of work on equal pay, recognizing and valuing work, women's work, and fairly paying women. So we thought it would be a good opportunity to hear from them on the different things that they've done in their organizations to drive this forward. So just a few notes around admin. And accessibility. So live captioning has been enabled for the event. So to access this, you can click on the three dots or more button at the top of the screen, then language and speech, then live captioning. And similar to our other webinars, we'll be recording the event and then sharing the link on our YouTube channel afterwards. And you can also find that link on our equally safe at work.scot website. And so we'll be hearing from our two speakers, and we'll save any questions until the end. But you can submit questions through the Q&A button. And if we're unable to respond to all the questions, then we'll try to answer them after the event. So I will hand over then to our first speaker, Lauren from GMB. So over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Kit. Let me just get this presentation up. Is that on the screen for you? So first of all, my name's Lauren Nelson-Mackey and I work for GMB Scotland's Women's Campaign Unit. I thought I would just give a bit of background about what we do and what I do internally that kind of led me to come here today. So one of the main parts of our unit is to help members ensure they're getting paid fairly for what they do. We work with members, reps, colleagues and employers to make work better for women. We work with members and employers to introduce policies like menopause policies, free period products and things like that. And we also provide our staff and reps with support and training and toolkits. We identify equal pay issues that have been raised by our members to see if it's something that we need to work with the employer to resolve and support members with job evaluation. Sorry, I'm just moving this about a bit so I can see. So a key part of my role, which ties in with all of the above, is to have a real understanding of how women are undervalued at work and why, and how we can fix it, preferably through industrial and formal routes of working with the employer. So in this presentation, I'll speak a bit about women's job skills and expertise being undervalued across different sectors, how it impacts women in workforces and what I see in my practice through work for GMB Trade Union. So why are women undervalued at work? In its simplest form, occupational segregation by gender is the split of men and women into different kind of job groups, being female-dominated jobs and male-dominated jobs. For example, many women will work as teachers and nurses, and we get a lot more men working in kind of engineering and construction jobs. The separation isn't usually because of ability, but it's because of social expectations, stereotypes, or unequal opportunities. In the female-dominated roles, we see undervaluing of the social skills that they need for their job, and kind of undervaluing of women's other natural skills that are kind of seen to come intrinsically to them. And a kind of systemic undervaluing of these skills by society. If we travel back to the past, women's skills and expertise at work has always been undervalued. And we do still see that today. For example, we all value our refuse collectors. We know which day they come, we know which days to take the bins out, we see them driving about, we see them cleaning the streets. And we visit recycling centres to drop things off at their place of work. They're very visible, and I would say the majority of us do value the work that they do. But women in female-dominated jobs are more hidden. They're in people's homes caring, they're in care homes, they're in school classrooms, and kitchens and indoor cleaning. But they are the backbone of our society. We just don't always realise that they're there. So what we mean when we talk about the undervaluation of women's work is basically women's skills, responsibilities and expertise that's required to do their roles not being recognised. And this leads to them being paid less, which means they have lower pay and they have to work more hours to make up their wages. In many roles, the pay is lower than it should be and undervalues these workers, and we'll look at some of these examples later. So let me see a bit. We've got a bit of history here. Sorry. I think I just skipped one. So before World War I, only 10% of women in Britain were employed. Most commonly, they worked in domestic services, cooks, maids and nannies, factories like textiles, sweated work, which was done at home or in workshops and was really kind of dirty work, but hidden. and kind of retail or waitressing jobs. And I think it kind of links back to what Kelsey was saying in her introduction about the kind of history of women's work. So during World War I, things changed. Women worked in many different roles. During the war, they worked in factories. One that I found was really interesting was in pilots, but only flying throughout the UK, as coders, radar operators, or in the Women's Land Army. So they did get that opportunity to show that they were willing and able to do these important jobs. And the war did alter the normal course of women's employment, which was a positive. However, they were far less likely to remain in the positions that were seen as men's work, and therefore, after the war, they were better paid. And after the war, women were expected to be at home again, carrying out caring duties, cleaning and cooking. Of course, so many women who were working during that time who had to support their families, so there was still a third of women in the UK that were unpaid work, but it was generally low-paid kind of women's work. So the point in us looking back at the history lesson is during the war, women's abilities and skills were recognised. However, we should probably not forget that they were still paid less in equivalent roles to men just because they were women. And again, this goes back to the societal view that's always kind of been there in the past of them being less able to do the roles as men. It also didn't help that women had the marriage bar, which meant that they had to stop employment once they were married, or carry out this low-paid women's work. And these core roles tie with women's natural skills, and they're some of the ones that we still see as being undervalued today, such as social care, childcare, catering and cleaning. We sometimes call these the 5 C's, so it's care, catering, cleaning, cashiering and clerical. And the kind of undervaluing of female-dominated jobs in these areas links to gender stereotyping of women who've historically carried out these roles in the past and at home. So GMB have recognised that this is a real problem, and we're actively working with employers across the UK to help them fix this. Systemic undervaluation in industries which has high concentrations of women, like we've just said, childcare, adult social care and cleaning, is extremely common, and they're quite often underpaid. This is something we've recognised as a real problem across many different sectors, in the public sector, the private sector, such as private care, and we also see it in retail. This is driven by societal views that women's work is unskilled or lower status, and this has been part of the entire history of women in the workplace. Sorry guys, I've scrolled too fast there. So the job skills and expertise needed to carry out female-dominated roles are undervalued across the sectors, and we'll look at examples of how this has kind of happened most recently in the sector. So I don't know if anybody on the call will have heard of the Fife judgment, but this is an example of undervaluation in the public sector. So the Employment Tribunal found that the assessment method was flawed when they were looking at assessing these jobs. And when they did assess the job scores that the female-dominated jobs were getting for their role, were underscored, and the male-dominated jobs were overscored, and this was actually kind of resulting in them being at opposite sides of grade boundaries. So one person, the male-dominated jobs were maybe in the higher grade, and the female-dominated jobs were in the lower grade. And this undervaluation of the female-dominated roles led to them being paid less than they should have for years. This is some of the wording that came from the Employment Tribunal judgment. So I pulled out these quotes because I thought they were really interesting, and they kind of talk about the issues they identified when they were assessing the jobs and what had been missed. So they had cooks, catering assistants and catering supervisors, none of whom seemed to use knives to cut up vegetables. They had specialist gardeners who were required to exercise more interpersonal skills than home carers. They had cleaners who didn't use any chemicals and didn't really clean toilets. And they had home carers who had to drive between jobs but not getting credit for that. Whereas they had other jobs such as storemen who were getting credit for driving forklift trucks even if they didn't. So what we can clearly see is the issues that have been raised, they just kind of show that even though we all have our knowledge of undervaluation of women, we're maybe not quite able to put that into practice, and we do have gender bias that's still coming into place. So undervaluation through job evaluation. Job evaluation is the process of assessing jobs by the tasks, responsibilities, skills and knowledge required to do the role. This is done within an organisation to create a fair and consistent pay structure, and a good evaluation evaluates roles, not people, has job holder input, and it's fair and consistent. And when it's not done right or it's not maintained, this is where we start to see problems, and this was the problem that they had in Fife. One of the biggest issues we do see is undervaluation and job evaluation scores of female-dominated jobs. So this is some risky practice in job evaluation. There's lots of different things that an employer needs to be aware of when they are looking at their job evaluation scheme to check that it's fair and consistent. So job creep, tasks being added on and becoming part of the role, that's more responsibility potentially being added that hasn't been accounted for. Gender bias, we do all have this to some extent, and we need to be mindful of it when evaluating jobs, especially if that is part of your job within your organisation. Old job evaluations, so there's an increased risk of developing that job creep or changes in the job description creating issues. Manual processing, not being run through proper job evaluation software. So this was common when job evaluation was first implemented in local authorities because we didn't have the technology that we have now. And some evaluations have actually never been updated. So some employers don't always actually have the paper trails to show why jobs have been scored the way that they have. And that's something that they should really be picking up on and making sure that they've got that, even if it means that they're redoing the job evaluation again. And that kind of comes into the next one, which is that inability to produce paperwork. How can it be justified why jobs have been scored the way they have if all the relevant paperwork isn't there anymore? Overly generic jobs and combining of roles. So a catering assistant might have completely different tasks and responsibilities versus like a cook in a care home. And the worst thing out of them all is to have no job evaluation scheme at all, because then how can you justify why roles are paid the way they are if there's no scheme, and who decides that? Lack of transparency with the job evaluation scheme and how it functions. Again, that can lead to concerns about its application and being overseen or delivered by managers with no training. So job evaluation analysis can be complex, and staff should be trained if they're involved in the process. Because job evaluation was first implemented a number of years ago now, you can find that your experienced people who were involved at the time might no longer be in the roles. So it's just about making sure that you've got those people in the roles that still have that knowledge to make sure that your pay structure is fair and consistent. So the first example we've got is Falkirk Council, which is also a public sector example. So carers were being undervalued as their role had not been assessed properly. Reevaluated in the same grade. So we'd really done a lot of practice and made a lot of effort internally to understand job evaluation schemes and to really get into the nitty-gritty and get the training from the independent advisor to the scheme, so that we really had an understanding of what was right and what was wrong, because we would never want to challenge something that was unfair, because you can't just put people up in job evaluation because you want them to be paid more. So the council had said it would remain the same grade, but we were certain that the outcome was wrong, so we asked them to seek independent advice from the advisor, and we did have to submit equal pay claims to protect our members' position, because at that point it seemed like we just weren't going to get to a conclusion. So this all started because the workers felt their pay was incorrect, so they contacted the union. A lot of employees don't actually know what their job evaluation scheme is or how it works, so it's unlikely somebody will come and ask for advice about their job evaluation. Likely they'll just feel like they may be being underpaid and they would like that to be looked into. So employers needed to work with trade unions to fix any undervaluation issues. The carers had to take strike action and they had to lose pay. But the council did recognise that they'd not actually evaluated the role correctly. And when they did get the independent advice and evaluate the role, it was going up a grade. So we actually ended up working really closely with the employer to make sure the evaluation was right, and we resolved the issue industrially and claims were withdrawn, which would have saved a lot of money as well. So our aim as a trade union is to make work better for working people, and one of the key ways to do this is to ensure that employees are being paid correctly for what they do. We would much rather not have to take equal pay claims. The Falkirk claims were submitted because Falkirk initially refused to fix the problem, but GMB members and trade unions were able to resolve the issues by working with the employer and get to that position where we could withdraw the claims. So that saved the council a lot of money in interest and court fees, and it also meant that members didn't have to wait 10 years for their back pay, which they were entitled to. And interestingly, the council also recognised that this may impact other care roles, so they're now evaluating kind of similar roles within the care setting, maybe care assistants in care homes, maybe care at home workers and rehab carers, those types of roles. They've thought, well, if we're changing this one, we better look at the kind of similar jobs and make sure that they're done correctly. So they're doing that along with us, and they've basically went from refusing to fix the issues to kind of being an example of best practice, because not only did they identify the inconsistency within the pay structure at the moment, but they looked at the consistency across the whole kind of care roles to check that it was correct. It's not going to result in every job coming up. It will result in some staying the same and other ones going up. But that's fair as long as it's been looked at properly and it's evaluating the tasks, responsibility and the skills and the knowledge of that the workers have to do their role. That is when we're happy and when the employer's happy and when the members are happy. So how undervaluation impacts women. They've got less job satisfaction, lack of progression in careers, and their earnings are capped, and actually more than a fifth of women have a persistent low income. This means they've got less money to spend on childcare and they're more likely to have to reduce their hours, which again it's a bit of a cycle because then you've got the kind of reduced quality of life and well-being. They've got maybe mental stress from choosing between working more hours and having a child in nursery more, or working less hours to spend time taking care of their children, which they would enjoy, but potentially taking a big drop in wages. So it's really a really difficult decision, which is made harder if their job is not paying them what it maybe should be paying. It also impacts the workforce because the employer will have higher turnover rates. You're much more likely to have your employees looking for a new job, which means you'll have higher training costs for new employees as well. And also strange relationships between employees and employers, which can lead to a less productive workforce. A less productive workforce can also tie in with sickness absence being worse. And you can also have a poor gender pay gap. And the biggest thing that for employers is probably that it can cause equal pay issues if we're not valuing women fairly. So how undervaluation can lead to equal pay issues. So by law, men and women must get equal pay for doing equal work. If a woman has been undervalued and therefore underpaid, there will almost always be a male comparator being paid correctly that she can use as a comparator. It's important to note that equal pay law is about the opposite sex, so a man could have an equal pay claim if he's been paid less than a woman, and the woman is the comparator. However, in our line of work and what we've seen so far, that it's generally women who are being paid less and who more commonly have equal pay issues that need to be addressed. But in all of our campaigns, there have been men involved who work alongside the women in underpaid roles, and they're also entitled to fair pay because they're still being undervalued because they're working in this predominantly female sector. Even though they're male, they're still entitled to the fair pay. So this is a picture of the Glasgow Women's Strike from 2018. And to make real change, we really all need to be involved. It's important everybody gets behind fair pay for all. Glasgow Women's Strike was 2018 and they had to go on strike because the issues were actually identified around 2007. So this was 11 years later. So the strike could have been avoided if Glasgow City Council had fixed their undervaluation of women earlier, and eventually basically they said enough was enough, and that's how the strike happened. But the refuse collectors came out on strike in solidarity during this. They had partners, mothers, friends and sisters who also worked in the underpaid roles, and they could see the job that they did and how much it should be valued. And even if they didn't have somebody who worked in the roles, they knew of the roles, and they just simply felt it was right to stand in support with their colleagues. It's probably important to say as well, actually though, that Glasgow is still ongoing. The discriminatory payments are actually still in place, but Glasgow is kind of in the final steps of fixing that by implementing their new job evaluation scheme. When this eventually comes into place, that should kind of eradicate the equal pay issues, and it will have a fair pay structure for all. So equal pay, this is a bit of equal pay law. So there's actually, I know we kind of talk about equal work and equal pay, but there's 3 different ways that equal pay is actually seen in law. So you've got light work, which is when a man and a woman are doing a similar job. So even if their job titles are slightly different or they're on different grades, if the job and the skills and the tasks are similar, this would be light work. So work rated as equivalent. This applies where jobs are different, but there's a job evaluation scheme, which is assess the values of the job and place them on the same grade. Or equal value, this is where the jobs are different. They haven't been graded the same under a common job evaluation scheme, but are equal in terms of skills, responsibilities and demand of the job. We find that generally men and women are paid the same for doing light work for their employer. It's very rare to have kind of men and women working in the exact same roles getting paid differently because employers and the public are aware of equal pay now. Where we do find issues is with rated as equivalent or equal value claims. Which is one where there's no job evaluation scheme or where the evaluations are incorrect, like in the Fife judgment, or there's just not an evaluation scheme at all and therefore no justification for why there's that pay inequality. And that brings us on to our first private sector example, which is Asda. So last month, many store roles were found to be of equal value to warehouse roles by a tribunal. So I just want you to take a minute to think about whether you think this is fair. Do you think warehouse operators deserve more? Or do you agree that store roles do equal work? Maybe you're not sure. And again, we need to be aware of our gender bias when we think about these roles, and just take that into account when we're making these decisions about what is equal value. We're starting to see equal pay claims in the private sector, where it's less likely that employers protect themselves with job evaluation schemes, and they struggle to defend why they pay women less than male-dominated sectors. But ultimately, regardless of what any of our opinions are about which roles are equal value, the Employment Tribunal's decided that many store roles are equal value, but at the same time, some of the store roles were found to not be of equal value. And again, that's back to us assessing every job individually, because even if you work in store, the demands of working in the produce department and the cash office as a checkout operator, they all have different demands and responsibilities. So Asda have been challenging the claim for over 10 years, and they've challenged it at every single stage. They have expressed to trade unions and the media that they do in fact value the warehouse roles more. Some years ago, an Asda supervisor explained that if they didn't have warehouse staff, they wouldn't have any products in the store. But for our members, the glaring issue was that if they didn't have store staff, then the products wouldn't be on the shelves or being sold at all. So I think this kind of remark just shows the kind of undervalue of roles women are doing is kind of accepted and normalised still within employers and some employers and in society at the moment. And that's something that I think we're all here on this call to kind of be aware of and address. So what did Asda actually say? So this is a quote from one of their press releases. So they said, at Asda, our hourly rates of pay in store are the same for female and male colleagues, and this is equally true in our depots. So that kind of goes back to what I kind of said earlier about the like work. When we do have people in the same role, we do find that they are paid the same. So pay rates in store differ from pay rates in distribution centres because the demands of the jobs in stores and jobs in distribution are very different. So I suppose the kind of issue here is, yes, the demands may be different, but they are equally of value, and that's what's not been recognised. But if we have big employers like Asda that don't understand the nuances of undervaluation of women and equal pay law, does anybody? Because I suppose we would expect them to really know what they were talking about. And I think this will be a really interesting landmark case when it comes to its conclusion. So we still have a way to go before this was concluded. It's not over yet. Next, Asda will have an opportunity to argue its reason other than gender difference for why shop floor and distribution staff are paid differently. Asda points out that the law has not been tested in the private sector, so they're quite aware that the equal pay in the private sector hasn't been raised in the past. As much anyway. So it's quite likely that private and third sector will be behind public sector because public sector employees have had to accept equal pay liability and fix their pay and grading structure for decades. So I thought this slide might be quite interesting for people because I think equal value can be really difficult to understand. And we often need to educate our own reps about this. So when they come into new training, new rep training, we have a session with them just to talk about job evaluation and equal value so that we're actually giving our reps that kind of base level of understanding for when they go back into the workplace. We do have members in the warehouse, and some of them are really frustrated when they first come in that the store staff have been found to be equal value. So we break down how different demands can lead to jobs being found to be of equal value. So for example, we've got a checkout operator and a warehouse operator here. So for physical effort, the checkout operator is probably most likely sitting at their till, maybe standing, but generally that will be the main part of their job. The warehouse operator might be lifting heavier things and they're likely to be walking about, so they would score higher for physical effort. For financial resources, your checkout operator is going to be dealing with money a lot more. Your warehouse operator might not be dealing with financial resources at all. Customer service, again, your checkout operator is going to be dealing with your customer service on a regular basis and you don't have any customer in the warehouse. Physical coordination, you probably need some physical coordination to operate your till and things. However, the warehouse operators might have a kind of higher level of physical coordination for things like driving a forklift and things like that. So we've kind of got two ticks on each side, and that's how, even though the job demands are different, they kind of overall end up being the same. And I will just say this is just my example. I've not actually read this in the court judgment yet, so that's just kind of my interpretation of how these things work. And I think one thing that makes our warehouse operators feel a bit more understanding about it is that nobody's saying that they're less value. We're saying that we think their pay is correct. What we're saying is that we think that the staff in the store, their roles are of equal value. And when you explain that in more detail, I think there's a more of an understanding and acceptance of that. So the biggest impact for women is time lost. Hours that could have been spent with our children as they grow up, hours that they could have spent with cherished family members, and missing important occasions and holidays to do extra shifts just so they can afford to live. The saddest part for those who've been undervalued and underpaid is knowing that they've spent so much time away from family and friends that they shouldn't have had to, because ultimately all of our members would rather have been getting paid correctly and get their lost time back rather than receive any big settlement at the end of it, because you can't get the time back. So we have had some settlements recently, such as in Birmingham and I think the Midlands, and these are just some examples of kind of what members have told us are using their settlements for. So some people were able to treat their families to once in a lifetime holidays. Others were able to get onto the property ladder as they now have had a deposit. So that's absolutely brilliant. However, so many women and men who got payouts were doing normal things that they should have been able to do throughout their career if they'd been paid fairly through that time. And I felt like that's what some of these quotes kind of showed. Like, people are not everybody is going out and spending money on holidays and things. They had less stress. They were able to do general everyday things and had that security net and didn't have to worry. So why is undervaluation still happening in 2026? So we've kind of spoke a bit about the systemic undervaluing of women's work. It's still happening today because society as a whole places a lower status and value on the work. And that's because those skills required are perceived to be intrinsic in women. There's also a lack of knowledge and understanding of the issues and how to fix them. A lack of job evaluation experience within employers who've maybe implemented their schemes quite a long time ago. And that goes back to us talking about losing those people who maybe had those skills. So making sure they're replaced. And there's also fear about opening a can of worms and concerns about financial costs, which are valid because if there's an undervaluation issue, there could be a cost to that. So how to fix it? Employers need to recognise there's a problem for pay justice to become a reality. You need to remove your own biases and ask questions. Is there an evaluation scheme in place? Is it fit for purpose? Look at your job evaluation. Look at the female and male dominated occupations. Does it seem right? Let me see what are there gender assumptions built into the job evaluation or pay and grading schemes? And are any evaluations outdated? Because if they are, there could be tasks and responsibilities that aren't being counted. Are there still job analysts employed with appropriate knowledge and understanding? One thing that's probably not used enough is that ACAS have an independent panel of experts who employers can contact to look at their job evaluation. They could look at it as a whole or a single one to let them know of any issues that they think maybe they need to look at to resolve. Job evaluation refresher training, again, that goes back to the experience, and working with trade unions preemptively and definitely when an issue is raised, because it will just grow. So challenging undervaluation and equal pay through the court system is difficult, time consuming and complicated. Asda's taken 15 years and it must have cost millions and millions of pounds. So if we want to value women's roles and ensure pay is fair, then we've got shared goals and we should all be working together to kind of make sure that we're meeting those goals as soon as possible and making work better for everyone. How to fix it for employees. Does your employer have a scheme? Get a copy of your job description and evaluation scores. Do they look right? You might not be sure because job evaluation can look really complex. And again, I have been looking at job evaluations for a few years now, and I still go back and question what something means. So get support from your trade union to understand your evaluation, or ask, if you're not in a trade union yet, you could ask somebody within your employer if they already have an understanding of it so that they could help you as well. If you think it's wrong, ask for your role to be evaluated with your trade union support, because that's what we're here for. We can't always guarantee that your role has been evaluated incorrectly, but the point is we'll go through the process, because as long as you have an understanding of what you're scored for and why, people feel a lot better about that, just to understand why they're paid the way that they are. So if employers don't fix the issue, problems will get worse, costs will become higher, staff will become unhappier, and unions will help members find their voice to challenge pay injustice. And thank you very much. That's my presentation finished, Kelsey.
Great. Thanks, Lauren. That was a really great presentation. And I think those quotes that you'd shared from how people were using their settlements was just, I think, yeah, really impactful to see how it impacts women and what they're using that for. So I'll just hand then over to Eileen McKenna, who is the Associate Director of Nursing Policy and Professional Practice at the Royal College of Nursing Scotland. So thanks for coming today, Eileen. It's over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Right, hang on. Do I put my... Right. So thanks for having me, particularly as today is International Nurses Day. So I think that was probably a bit of a coincidence, but so happy International Nurses Day. So my role within the Royal College of Nursing is Associate Director for Nursing Policy and Professional Practice. The Royal College is both a trade union and a Royal College, a professional body. So the majority of my role is around influencing policy, whether that be government policy, legislation that affects the nursing profession, or clinical policies. So I'm going to start off with a bit of a history lesson of the gendered origins of nursing. And as I said, it's International Nurses Day, and it's the birthday of Florence Nightingale. That's why the 12th of May is the date that's chosen. So modern nursing emerged in the 19th century with a highly gendered social context. The professionalisation of nursing is strongly associated with Florence Nightingale, who positioned nursing as a respectable occupation for women, grounded in moral virtue, discipline and self-sacrifice. And those underpinning principles of what it meant to be a nurse kind of endured right into the 70s, where registered nurses had to leave if they got married, had to leave the profession if they got married, etc., etc. So the work of Florence did help legitimise nursing as a career, but it also embedded the profession within a gender hierarchy. Nursing was constructed as an extension of women's domestic caring roles, while medicine developed as a male-dominated, scientific and authoritative profession. Then we move on into the 70s and the 80s, and probably up to the present day. Nursing was framed as subordinate to the male-dominated medical profession and limited independent judgment, allegedly. So nurses were expected to follow medical direction rather than exercise, as I said, independent judgment. And these historical foundations continue to shape the contemporary perceptions of nursing as supportive rather than leading, practical rather than intellectual. So if we look at the legacy of that, we can see that these origins influence professional boundaries, educational structures, and the ongoing struggle for recognition of nursing expertise. If you look at the images I've put up, you know, so from a cartoon back in the 20s, 30s, the early 20th century, you can see that the girl is predicted as a nurse and the boy is predicted as a doctor. Then we move on to the First World War, and that's when the nurses as angels came into domination. And the last image, I don't know if anybody recognises this from COVID, the COVID pandemic in 2020, where Banksy produced this image of the nurse as a superhero. Nurses didn't feel like superheroes. they felt that COVID had a huge impact on nurses and nursing. Many nurses left their home to continue working and not take infection back to their children or their loved ones. So it had a huge impact. So we look at the sort of current day perception of nurses. Nurses are perceived as having the same stereotypical traits as women: caring, kind, helpful, nurturing, intuitive, sensitive, dependent, conforming, subjective, passive, fragile, non-aggressive, and less intellectually capable than other professions within health and social care. There are positive perceptions. Nurses are needed, respected and trusted. Nursing is still one of the most trusted professions. Nurses have job security, but opportunities are limited. Nurses have a meaningful job, but have a low status in society. Nurses' working conditions are hard, stressful, and there's risk of injury. And nursing perceived as less intellectual than other health professions. We still have lack of autonomy, and believe it or not, nothing against office workers, but it's seen as having a similar status to office work, not other health professional roles. Nurses are not seen as in leadership roles, and they're still seen as being directed by doctors. And this was from research that was carried out in 2022. I just thought, again, looking back at the history, changes to nurse education in the UK from the 60s to the late 80s, nursing was an apprenticeship model. It was still a 3-year apprenticeship. And if we move on to 2013, nursing became an all-graduate profession on entry. And I've added 2018, the NMC, which is the Nursing and Midwifery Council, published new standards for nursing undergraduate programmes. In the red boxes, I've put the pay evaluation schemes that impacted on nurses. So in 1988, clinical grading was introduced, right at the end of nursing being an apprenticeship model. So the pay evaluation was already behind the curve in terms of the level of education that was required to be a registered nurse. If you look at Agenda for Change, which is the current pay evaluation scheme for all health workers in the NHS, apart from medics and dentists, it was introduced in 2004 when nursing was becoming either a diploma or degree programmes, and then has not been updated despite nursing being an all-graduate profession. So understanding the history is key to promoting nursing as a skilled, knowledgeable, safety critical and leadership orientated profession. The RCN in 2023 published its new definition of nursing, and historically actually defining nursing has been really difficult because nursing roles are so diverse. However, the short version of the definition is that nursing is a safety critical profession founded on 4 pillars: clinical practice, education, research and leadership. Registered nurses use evidence-based knowledge, professional and clinical judgment to assess, plan, implement and evaluate high quality person-centred nursing care. As I said, nursing roles are across a wide spectrum of clinical areas, from hospitals to care homes, people's own home, prisons and schools, etc. In 2018, the Nursing and Midwifery Council, they regulate all nurses have to register with the NMC, and they put out ambitious new standards that set out the skills and knowledge of the next generation of nurses. So in summary, the new standards said that nurses at the point of registration must be able to demonstrate greater depth of knowledge and skills, and have more advanced skills to meet the specific care needs of people in their chosen field of nursing practice. Now you're thinking, why is that all relevant? It's relevant because the impact of gender on the profession, which I'm coming on to. So gender influences who becomes a nurse, and it impacts on society's perceptions and the economic rewards of nursing work, i.e. pay. Policy, gender dynamics affect workforce planning structures, leadership opportunities in the UK nursing sector. And it's also a lens to examine the power and historical inequalities between nursing and medicine and other health professions. And gender shapes nursing staff's daily experience, including their emotional labour, career progression and recognition. Right. So approximately 90% of nurses globally are female, and that is shaped by social norms linking women to the caregiving roles. The graph is the NHS Scotland gender distribution of nursing, and I took this data off what's publicly available just a few days ago. And you can see for all nursing in Scotland that just over 90% of nurses are female. However, there is differences depending on the field of practice. Adult nursing, which is your hospitals, community, any role that is caring for an adult that has a physical condition. Again, about 90% are women. If you look at district nursing, that drops to about 5%, and health visiting, which are highly skilled nurses who care for children, babies, children and families in the community sector, 99% of health visitors are female. When you look at learning disabilities and mental health nursing, you can see that there is a higher proportion of males in those fields of practice. Over 20% of nurses are male. And then in paediatrics, so nurses who look after children, again, that proportion drops significantly. If we look at the impact on pay, this data compares nursing. So, as I said earlier, nurses, midwives, allied health professionals, and clinical scientists are all on Agenda for Change pay evaluations schemes and pay rates. But you can see there's a huge difference. So bands 2 to 4 are support worker bands. Band 5 is what's considered entry level for any registered health profession. And then you go up the pay bands to band 6 up to band 9 for more senior roles. And you can see for nursing that about 30% of nursing work has been delegated to support workers, which is about half of midwifery or allied health professional roles, support roles. Interestingly, band 5, which was said is the entry level for all registered health professionals, 40% of nurses are band 5. That is significantly different from midwives, where less than 10% are band 5 and less than 15% of AHPs are band 5. And you can see that when you go up the more senior pay grades, nursing there's a significant difference between nurses and midwives and allied health professionals. When you get into the senior pay grades, band 8A to 9, only 2.3% of nurses and midwives are sitting in these pay scales, where 5% of allied health professionals are sitting on the higher pay scales. So I said earlier that district nursing is predominantly female. Mental health, still predominantly female, but has a higher proportion of men in that field of nursing. And you can see that there's pay disparity across the Agenda for Change pay bands for a highly female-dominated field of nursing, and we're one that has a higher proportion of men. Now, I have to explain district nurses. The NMC state district nurses have to have a higher qualification. It's called this SPQ qualification, which is at master's level, to give them the knowledge and skills required to care for people independently and autonomously in their own homes. But 50% of nurses within district nursing teams in Scotland are at band 5, the entry level, whereas only 30% of mental health nurses are sitting at band 5. So there's a distinct difference. We have challenged, and I'll come on to later in some of the challenge we've put around district nurses' pay. When you look in mental health agenda for change distribution, you can see there's a gender difference, with the females being predominantly at the band 5-6 level, with a larger proportion of male mental health registered nurses being at band 7 and 8 than females, despite it still being just about 80% a female workforce. What impact does that have? So the stereotypes deter men from entering nursing, but also lead to burnout among women tolerating poor working conditions. This slide I've taken from our workforce report. So the RCN in Scotland publish a workforce report. We look at all the available data, and this is the leavers by age group. So this is people who have left nursing since 2015 by age group, and you can see currently about 50% of the leavers are early and middle career nurses. So they're nurses in their 20s, 30s and 40s who are leaving the profession. And that has a significant impact on the workforce and recruiting. You have to recruit more people into undergraduate programmes to replace the nurses that leave. When we look at working conditions, we survey our members regularly around their working conditions, and you can see that 76% of nurses in Scotland said they worked over their contracted hours at least once a week, and some more than once a week, and that's normally unpaid. 70% said they're under too much pressure, 66% said they couldn't provide the care at the level that was required. Only 40% said they were happy with their working hours, with 35% happy with their shift length. NHS Scotland has moved to a predominantly 12-hour shift system for nurses. Now, some nurses like 12-hour shifts, but that because of it gives them more days off to care for children, etc. But there's lots of evidence around the impact of 12-hour shifts on well-being and quality of patient care. 30% report they can't balance work-life balance. 57% said they were considered leaving because they were undervalued at the staffing levels or they were under too much pressure. And 35% had experienced physical abuse and verbal abuse. And 40% had to complete their mandatory training at home. We then look at recruitment and the sort of the issues around recruiting into undergraduate programmes. These graphs are, again, this is government data, and you can see that for the last few years, the universities have failed to fill all their undergraduate nursing places, and that's across all fields of nursing, apart from paediatrics. So children's nursing is still is a much smaller field of nursing, but it's usually oversubscribed. Then, gender and power dynamics. I mentioned earlier around the power differences between medicine and nursing. Now, that's not to say it happens all the time. Many multi-professional teams work well together, but I've just highlighted sort of a recent event. So the junior doctors within the British Medical Association have put out what they said was the result of a survey in the last few weeks, saying that there are safety fears as UK hospitals use nurses to cover for doctors due to shortage of medics, half of NHS hospital nurses who work on doctors' rotas, and using advanced practitioners on doctors' rota is a patient safety concern. These nurses who work at that level have undertake further education and training. They're at master's level. They have to achieve competencies, clinical competencies, as well as master's level education. And there is actually no evidence that it causes harm. I've just taken the headlines from some international research into advanced practice nursing roles that basically says they are as effective and as safe as junior doctors. So it's just a recent example of the power dynamics between interprofessional groups. So what are we doing about it? So back in 23-24, all Agenda for Change, the pay negotiations in Scotland for Agenda for Change, the Royal College of Nursing members did not accept that pay deal. So we were in pay dispute with the Scottish Government. Rather than take industrial action for a percentage uplift on Agenda for Change, we looked to see what we could get for the nursing profession. And we got the review of Band 5 nursing roles, reduced working week and protected learning time, and a ministerial nursing and midwifery task force to look at the working conditions. So for the Band 5 nursing roles, that's been ongoing for a couple of years. Progress has been slow, but the majority of nurses at Band 5 level who have asked for a job evaluation and the work that they currently do are being upgraded to Band 6. The Nursing Midwifery Task Force is ongoing. There's 44 changes and recommendations to improve nursing conditions. The gloves are off. It was our manifesto campaign for the recent Scottish parliamentary election. Many of our asks in that were picked up across all political parties. So the job now is to make sure that they take action on their promises. Key takeaways, I'm not going into that because I've covered all of that. And basically, thank you for listening and happy to take questions. And I'll stop sharing.
Great. Thanks, Eileen, for covering all of that. We are almost out of time today, so we actually only have just 1 minute left. So I think we'll probably have to hold off on taking any questions because I'm sure we'll go over time with all of that. But thank you so much for your presentations. And if anyone has any questions that they'd like answered, please feel free to get in touch with us afterwards, and we'll try to get that answered for you. But thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we'll share the recording for the webinar afterwards. And thanks again to our speakers, Lauren and Eileen.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye now.